He looked straight at me and said, "Old men shouldn't rot in houses they can't keep up with." The words hit harder than any winter wind off the bay. They didn't come from a stranger. They came from Luke, the boy I once carried on my shoulders through county fairs. The boy whose skinned knees I washed with trembling hands. My name is Walter Crane. I'm 71. A carpenter who spent his life shaping other people's homes and, at the end, built one for myself and for Claire, my wife of 45 years. She picked the lilac curtains in the living room, said they made the afternoon light soft enough to forgive anything. That morning, Luke wouldn't meet my eyes. His wife hovered by the hallway arch, cradling a coffee mug like a trophy. Luke said they needed the house for a while. Her parents were moving in, and there wasn't enough room for everyone. He said I'd be more comfortable at a motel near the interstate until they sorted things out. In vain, I looked past him at the mantel. Claire and I sanded smooth. The picture frames were still there. Our wedding day. Luke's first baseball game. The Christmas Claire insisted on putting tinsel on every lamp. Everything seemed to belong to me and yet no longer did. I wanted to tell him this house was built nail by nail from my hands, that its walls knew my laughter and my prayers. Instead, I set my mug down so carefully it didn't even clink against the counter. I asked when they planned for me to leave. "By Thursday," he said, as if he were asking me to step aside for a passing car. I walked to the bedroom, pulled open the cedar chest Claire loved, and took only what I could hold without shaking. My wedding band on a chain, her favorite scarf with the scent of soap and spring. I left the recliner by the window, the small radio, the old quilt we bought at a roadside market. At the door I paused, hoping the house would argue for me. It stayed silent, only the screen door tapping against the frame like an unsure heartbeat. I stepped onto the porch. The breeze from Harlow Bay smelled of salt and rust. Luke stayed on the path, hands jammed in his pockets, a man pretending not to see what he'd just broken. I sat behind the wheel of my truck for a long time before turning the key. The house loomed in the mirror, small against the stretch of Harlow Bay, yet heavy as a full chest. I drove only a mile before stopping at the bluff where Claire and I used to watch the tides crawl in. The water was gray that morning, rough with wind, and I could almost hear her voice telling me to breathe before anger swallowed my ribs. Memory is a stubborn thing. It barged in without asking. I saw Claire again in the kitchen the day we signed the deed, her hair tied with the scarf I now kept in my pocket. She had laughed at how serious I looked holding a pen, said a home wasn't just lumber. It was a promise to keep living together. We had spent nights sanding the banister, painting walls in shades she called gentle weather. Every nail, every brush stroke carried us through sickness, through winters that iced the windows and summers so hot. We slept on the floor to stay cool. I thought about the workshop I built out back, the smell of cedar and varnish clinging to my shirts. Luke learned to plane wood there. His small hands once clung to mine as we carved a birdhouse for his third-grade fair. He'd painted it the color of lemons. Proud, even when the brushstrokes ran thick, I still kept that crooked thing in a corner of the shed. It looked at me now from memory, accusing and tender all at once. The drive back from the bluff was slow. Each house I passed felt like a mirror of what I was losing. Porches with rocking chairs, curtains shifting in soft wind, families eating breakfast with doors half open to let the morning in. I used to belong to mornings like that. I thought of Claire setting plates on the table, humming along with the radio, sunlight settling in her hair. She's been gone 8 years, but some days I still turn to speak to her before remembering silence is all that answers. Inside, I walked from room to room as if for the last time. The hallway smelled of pine polish and faint dust. I touched the wall where Luke's height marks were carved, from toddler scribbles to the year he shot past me in height. I traced each line with my thumb, feeling how quickly a boy becomes a man, and how quickly a man can forget the shoulders that carried him. Evening light crept across the living room rug when I finally sat down. My hands rested on my knees, empty and heavy. I thought about how a life's work can become a guest in its own home, and how love doesn't always defend you from the people you love most. Claire would have told me to hold steady, to not let bitterness rot what was still good. I closed my eyes and promised her I'd try. The next morning, I asked Luke to sit with me at the kitchen table. The sun hadn't cleared the fog outside, and the house felt caught between night and day. He came in slow, coffee in hand, his eyes sliding across the room instead of meeting mine. Beside him, Megan hovered with her phone, scrolling like she needed something to lean on. I cleared my throat, steadying my voice. Luke, we need to talk about yesterday. He set the mug down too hard. A splash ran over his fingers, but he didn't flinch. Dad, we went over this, he said. It's temporary. Megan's parents have nowhere to go. They sold their condo faster than they expected. Megan nodded, murmuring that they were in a tight spot. Her tone was sweet, but her arms folded across her chest like a fence. I kept my hands flat on the table, palms down, the way Claire used to when she didn't want an argument to spin out. I built this home with your mother. Every wall has something of us in it. If they stay, where do I belong? Luke sighed, rubbing his jaw. You're overthinking. We just need space for them for a few months. You can stay at that motel off Route 9 or maybe with Uncle Fred. You'll be fine. Another with a hostage, Megan added. It's not like we're throwing you away. It's just... Her voice softened, but her eyes were firm, already claiming corners of the house in her head. I felt my pulse thrum against the edge of the table. Practicality doesn't mean erasing someone, I said quietly. Your mother spent her last spring planting roses out front. You learned to ride your bike on this driveway. And now you're asking me to pack those years in a suitcase. It's some we had wise. For a moment, Luke's face flickered with something remorse. Maybe. But it disappeared under a shrug. Dad, don't make this harder than it is. You'll still have your things. And once Megan's folks find a place, you'll come back. The way he said it, like scheduling a delivery, pulled something sharp from my chest. I looked at the clock over the stove. The second hand swept circles as if mocking us. I wanted to slam my fist down, to shout that a man's life isn't a room to be cleared out for visitors. Instead, I breathed slow, the way Claire taught me when grief pressed too tight. I won't argue, I said, voice low. But you need to understand you're asking me to leave more than a house. You're asking me to step out of my own history. Megan shifted uncomfortably. Luke stood, restless, and walked to the window. We don't have time for drama. Dad. Thursday. That's all I can give you. He left the room, leaving the smell of scorched coffee and the hollow sound of a door clicking shut. I sat alone, staring at the wood grain on the table, tracing its lines the way I once traced Luke's tiny fingers. My heart felt like old timber, splintered but still trying to hold. I packed in silence. I did not trust my voice. If it came out wrong, it would sound like begging, and I would not beg in my own house. I set the tin box on the bed and opened it. The hinge squeaked the way it always had. Inside were deeds, insurance papers, old letters Claire wrote when we still lived in a rented duplex with thin walls and loud neighbors. I took the papers and the letters. I took the ring on its chain. I took the scarf. I took a pocket knife with a cracked handle that my father gave me when I was 12. Everything else stayed. I pulled the sweater that still smelled faintly of cedar from the wardrobe and folded it once. The room looked at me with the blank stare of a place that knows it will be empty. I stepped into the hallway and paused by the marks on the doorframe. The pencil lines showed Luke at 6, 8, 10, taller each year. Half smile when he asked to be measured again. I pressed my thumb there and felt a sting that did not belong to the skin. In the living room, I picked up the small wooden bird I carved the winter. Claire was sick. It fit in my palm like a warm stone. The old radio sat on the shelf, mute. The dial stuck between stations. I left it. A radio is for a home that can hold music. This room had become a waiting room for someone else's plans. I folded the quilt that lived on the back of the sofa and placed it over the arm, as if tucking an old friend in for a nap. Then I put it back. Let the house keep one thing of mine while I am gone. Let it remember I did not leave in anger. Megan appeared by the arch. She was barefoot, careful not to touch the rug with her heels. Her voice was light. She asked if I needed help with boxes. I said no. A man can carry what matters without a box. She nodded and told me her parents would arrive Thursday afternoon. She said they were excited about the ocean air. She used a bright tone the way people do when they are trying to make a hard thing sound like a good idea. I thanked her for the notice. My words felt dry in my mouth. In the kitchen, I rinsed my mug and set it upside down on the rack. The drain hissed for a second, then went quiet. Claire liked this corner clean. I wiped the counter and folded the towel with my thumbs lined to the edge. The way she had taught me. Corners, meeting corners. I opened the drawer with the old silverware and took the tiny spoon with the dent from when Luke chewed it as a baby. It was not worth much in money. It was worth a room of air to me. I stood at the back door for a minute and looked at the yard. The raised bed was full of tired soil, and the rosemary bush had grown wild. A gull floated above the fence, riding a gust off Harlow Bay. The shed door hung a little crooked. I could have fixed it in 10 minutes with a screwdriver and a new screw. My hands knew the fix by heart. I let the door hang. Some repairs can wait. Some are not mine anymore. I took a breath and walked to the front. The light had shifted. Afternoon was leaning toward evening. That hour when the house used to soften and settle. I put on my coat. I checked my pockets like a ritual. Papers, ring, scarf, knife, keys. The key felt heavy in my palm. I closed my fingers around it so I would not hear it jingle. The sound might have broken me. On the porch, the boards spoke in their old language. The middle step had a long groove from years of boots. I sat on the top step and looked at the street. Mrs. Ellis across the way was watering the lilies. She raised her hand, and I raised mine back. Her mouth shaped a question, and I shook my head. I did not want to explain. I did not want sympathy to crack open what I was holding shut. Luke lingered by the gate, pretending to scroll his phone. A boy once hid behind those same hands when thunder scared him. Now he hid from his father. I stood and walked down the path. When I reached him, he cleared his throat. He said he would help carry things. I said I had what I needed. He said he would book the motel. I said I would handle it. He said he was sorry, it felt harsh. I said it did. There was nothing else to add that would not turn into a fight. At the mailbox, I ran my palm over the number Claire painted years ago. The paint had faded to soft gray. I remembered her tongue between her teeth while she worked. The small frown she wore when she tried to get the curve of a number just right. She had that same frown when she braided our granddaughter's hair. She had it when she wrote gift tags at Christmas. That frown was love doing careful work. I opened the gate and stepped onto the sidewalk. The wind off the water tasted like salt and pennies. The sky over Harlow Bay was a flat sheet of pewter with a thin rip of light on the horizon. A gull called once. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked twice and then gave up. Tires hissed on wet pavement. Somewhere, a train horn sounded low and far. The kind of sound that makes the air feel older. I walked to my truck with the envelope tucked under my coat. My hands did not shake until I reached the door handle. I told them to be still. I got in and sat with the key in the ignition but did not turn it. The house filled the mirror. It was smaller in glass, almost toy-sized, but the weight of it pressed behind my ribs. Every room in there held a piece of me. A man can live without many things. He cannot live without a place where his breath belongs. I turned the key, and the engine coughed awake. The wipers dragged once across the windshield and left a clear stripe through the blur. I pulled away, slow, like a boat untying from a dock. As I turned the corner, I saw the lilac bush by the fence move in the breeze. And for a foolish second, I thought it was Claire waving. I kept my eyes on the road. I drove through town with careful hands. The bakery had its chalkboard sign out with the day's specials. The barber sat in his doorway with a newspaper folded in half. At the hardware store, a kid rolled a rack of shovels to the door. Harlow Bay was doing what it always did. It was living. The world does not pause for a man's private storm. I reached the bluff and parked, where you can see the harbor unfold. The tide was coming in, slow and certain. I got out and stood in the cold air. The scarf around my neck lifted and fell like it wanted to breathe for me. I closed my eyes and told Claire I was leaving for a while. I said I would keep my back straight and my heart soft, the way she always asked. I opened my eyes and tasted the salt again. It stung and it cleaned at the same time. When I turned back toward town, I did not look in the mirror. I wanted the road to run straight, even if my life had turned. I drove to the edge of Harlow and stopped at the small church where Claire liked the morning light. The door was open. I went in and sat near the back. It smelled of lemon oil and old wood. I did not pray for victory. I prayed for a way through that did not ruin what was left of us. I sat a long time, until the ache in my chest settled into something I could carry. Then I drove to a quiet street where the motel sign buzzed in tired blue. I parked and turned off the engine. The silence that followed was wide enough to fall into. I took the envelope, the ring, the scarf. I stepped out into the thin light and shut the door with care, as if noise might break the last small thing inside me that still held. The motel room smelled of damp curtains and coffee left too long on a burner. I set my envelope and the scarf on the desk, then lowered myself onto a mattress that sighed under my weight. For a moment I just stared at the ceiling. Faint water stains spread like maps of places I had never been. I felt like someone waiting for a train that might never arrive. I unpacked slowly. 2 shirts, folded. The wedding ring on its chain. Claire's scarf. A small notebook for thoughts I couldn't say out loud. I placed them in a neat line. A way to remind myself I still owned order, even if I had lost a roof. The rest of my things fit into one drawer. My life had become a drawer. Outside, a neon sign buzzed in the mist. Across the lot, a couple argued quietly beside a pickup truck, their voices drifting like smoke. A boy from the next room sat on the curb, throwing pebbles at a soda can. He waved. I raised a hand back. It felt strange, acknowledging someone when I was trying to be invisible. I walked to the diner down the road. The waitress, a woman with silver hair and bright eyes, greeted me with a smile that seemed older than the town. She called me sir, poured coffee, and asked if I wanted eggs or pie. I chose pie. Warm, apple. Crust cracked at the edge. As I ate, I caught my reflection in the window, a man trying to look steady while the ground shifted. Back in the room, I sat by the window. Harlow Bay's lights shimmered across the water. I thought about Claire standing at our fence, calling Luke in for dinner, her voice lifting over the gulls. I thought about Luke as a child, how he used to crawl into our bed after a nightmare, clutching my sleeve. The boy I once protected was the man who had shown me the door. Later, I met the motel owner, A short man named Harris. He wore flannel and smelled faintly of tobacco. He said if I needed a longer stay, he'd work out a weekly rate. You look like you've been through something, he added, not pressing for details. I thanked him, surprised at how kindness from a stranger could scrape against grief. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the house in my head. The click of our front latch, the hum of the refrigerator, the sigh of floorboards under Claire's steps. I thought about what I'd said to Luke, how calm I sounded, though every word cut deeper than I let on. I wondered if Claire would have been proud of my composure, or if she would have urged me to fight harder. I rose before dawn and went outside. The air smelled of seaweed and diesel from the fishing boats heading out. I followed the sound of water until I reached the small dock behind the motel. The bay was a dark sheet, waiting for light. I sat there until the sky turned from charcoal to silver. For a moment, I believed I felt Claire's hand on my shoulder, steadying me. When I returned to the room, I decided I would not let sadness settle into stone. I brewed motel coffee, wrote a line in my notebook. A man is not finished because others forget his worth. The letters were shaky, but they were mine. I placed the notebook back on the desk, beside the scarf, and promised myself I'd keep moving, even if each step had to be carved out of heavy air. By mid-morning, I knew I could not drift another day. I took the envelope from the motel desk and drove into town. The lawyers kept offices above the old bakery on Harbor Street. The bell on the bakery door rang when I went through to the back stairs. The smell of yeast and sugar followed me up. The glass door at the top said Rivera and Ames. Inside was quiet. A clock ticked on a wall the color of cream. A young man at the desk asked my name and offered water. I told him I needed to speak about a house that had forgotten who owned it. He gave a small nod that told me he had heard stranger sentences. Ms. Rivera met me in a room lined with books. She wore a navy dress and a plain silver watch. Her hair was tied back. She shook my hand and sat with a pad in front of her. Her voice was steady in the way of someone who has carried other people's storms for years. I set the envelope between us and opened it. I showed her the deed. I told her what Luke had said. I did not tell her about the insult at the start. Some words are better left on the floor where they fell. She read the papers and asked careful questions. Whose name was on the deed? How long I had lived there? Whether I had ever rented space to anyone? Whether I had given anyone permission to stay? I answered simple. Mine. Decades. Never. No. She made notes. She said the law did not always move fast, but it did not usually lose its way. She laid out 3 paths in words I could hold. The first was a letter revoking permission for anyone who was not me to occupy the house. It would state that I was the owner and that they had no right to keep me out. The second was a formal notice asking them to leave by a date that was fair. The third, if they refused, was a petition to the court that asked for immediate help. She told me I was never to change locks or drag anyone out. That would only hurt me. I nodded. My hands had put roofs over families. They would not tear one off a head, even now. I asked if a letter could be clear without being cruel. She said a letter could be firm and still carry a hope for better days. She said I should decide the size of the window I wanted to leave open. I thought of Claire at the kitchen sink, telling me that a man is measured by how he handles a no. I said I wanted the window open enough for my son to climb through if he chose. Ms. Rivera wrote while I spoke. I watched her hand move across the page. It did not rush. It did not shake. She read it aloud so I would hear how it sounded in the room. It said I was the owner. It said I had not consented to the new arrangement. It asked that all guests leave within 7 days. It invited Luke to speak to me privately so we could make a plan that honored our family as well as the law. It told them that if they ignored the letter, I would ask the court to help me come home. There was no threat in the words. There was only the shape of a door. We printed 2 copies. She slid them into a new folder and marked dates on a calendar. She told me to keep a simple log. Times. Places. Who said what in plain lines. She told me to gather things that quietly prove a life. Utility bills with my name on them. Photos. Any neighbor who had watched me leave. I thought of Mrs. Ellis with her lilies. I thought of Harris at the motel desk. I thought of the ring on the chain and the height marks on the doorframe. She reminded me that a judge is also a person. People can see when a man is acting from care and not from fury. Before I left, she gave me one more piece of advice. Speak little. Read slowly. Do not answer insult with insult. If the room grows hot, step outside and count to 10. I told her I had been counting to 10 since Tuesday. She gave the smallest smile. The kind that admits the world is heavy, and we are still here. I walked out with the folder under my arm and the smell of fresh bread rising from below. On the street, the wind cut through my coat. I crossed to the church and went inside. The place was empty except for a woman lighting a candle. I sat halfway down, where the light through the side window turned soft about noon. I did not ask for victory. I asked for a steady hand and a kind mouth. I asked for Luke to remember the man who taught him how to use a plane. I asked to be the sort of father who can make a stand without breaking what he stands on. Outside, I stopped at the office supply store for a spiral notebook and a blue pen. At the counter, the clerk asked if I needed anything else. I said I needed time. She said they did not stock that yet. We both smiled a little. In the truck, I wrote the first lines of the log with the date and the words that had pushed me out. I wrote the plan in plain words so I could see it. Deliver the letter. Ask for a talk with Luke alone. Give 7 days. If they choose noise, choose paper. At the motel, I read the letter again. The words sat straight on the page. They were not brave. They were clean. I placed the copy for Luke in the folder. I slid Claire's scarf from my neck and laid it across the desk. I told her I was going to knock before using a key. I told her I would keep my back straight even if my voice shook. I told her I would give our boy one last chance to be the man she believed he could be. In the afternoon, I walked to the pay box by the diner. My hand hovered over the numbers that used to call our house. I called Luke. He answered on the 3rd ring. I asked him to meet me on the porch just after sunrise. I said I wanted a quiet talk. No audience. He hesitated. He said he was busy. I said I would be there anyway. He sighed and said fine. I slept a little that night. Not much. I pictured the porch light, the worn groove on the step, the little chip in the paint near the knob where Claire used to tap her ring when her hands were full. I pictured Luke as a boy leaning against the doorframe, eyes wide after his first day of school. I told the dark that a father is allowed to knock. I told the dark I would wait for the latch to turn. When dawn began to thin the sky, I dressed in my best shirt. I placed the letter and the deed in the folder. I slipped the ring on its chain under the collar, where it could rest against my skin. I wrapped the scarf once and tucked the end into my coat. Outside, the air was sharp and clean. The world had washed its face in night rain. I put the folder on the seat beside me and drove toward the little house with the lilac bush. Toward the porch where I would ask my son to look at me without noise. The sun was only a pale rim behind the pines when I turned onto Birch Lane. My hands stayed tight on the wheel. Every board of that house waited in the quiet, holding its breath. I parked at the curb and sat still for a moment, letting the engine tick itself calm. The lilac bush beside the porch trembled in a light breeze, like it remembered me. Luke opened the door before I reached the steps. He had not shaved, and there was sleep folded in the corners of his eyes. Megan stood behind him, holding a mug. Her parents were already inside, voices rising and falling with the clink of dishes. For a second, I almost turned back to the truck. But I felt Claire's scarf against my collarbone and stayed where I was. "I need a word with you," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Alone." Luke glanced over his shoulder. Megan started to speak, but I lifted the folder just enough so they could see the edge of paper. "This is between a father and his son." Luke stepped out onto the porch and closed the door, though not all the way. Laughter from inside leaked through the gap. We sat on the bench Claire used to brush with teak oil every spring. The wood was dry now, rough under my palms. Luke cleared his throat. "Dad, I don't want this to get ugly." I placed the letter on my knee. "Ugly came when you forgot whose roof this is." My voice surprised me, not for its sharpness but for how quiet it was. I opened the folder and slid the letter across the bench. "I'm giving you 7 days to clear the house of guests," I said. "After that, I'll ask the court to help me come home." Luke's jaw tightened. "You're serious?" I nodded. "I'm still willing to talk, just you and me, but not with a room full of people waiting to see if I'll fold. And within Wime, and one knows of you." The front door moved, and Megan stepped out, followed by her mother. The older woman looked me over as if measuring how much space I might take from her comfort. "Is there a problem?" she asked. Luke stood, uneasy. "Go back inside," he told them. But they hovered. Megan's father appeared behind them, a paper plate in hand, already acting like the porch belonged to him. I stayed seated. "This isn't for debate," I said. "Luke and I are speaking." I put the folder back on my lap, palms resting over it. I could feel the grain of the cardboard through my gloves. A reminder to stay rooted. Claire always said a man's strength is in how still he can keep himself when the room tilts. Luke crouched down, elbows on his knees. "I didn't mean to push you out, Dad. I just thought it would be easier for everyone." He glanced at the door again, then back at me. "I can talk to them tonight. Maybe we can figure something out without lawyers." I met his eyes. "I don't want fights," I said. "But I won't live as a visitor in the house your mother and I built." "Agree." The air between us felt heavy, full of words neither of us wanted to use. Behind the screen, Megan's parents whispered. Megan looked at Luke, waiting for him to choose. He rubbed his forehead, the same gesture he used as a boy when he couldn't solve a riddle. "All right," he said finally. "Leave the paper. Give me today to read it." "See." I rose from the bench. "I'll come back tomorrow afternoon. Bring an answer." "Luke." Not a delay. I walked down the steps, careful not to rush. At the truck. I looked once at the house. Through the window I could see the kitchen table, the spot where Claire used to set out cinnamon bread on Sundays. That small memory pressed behind my ribs as I started the engine. Driving away, I felt the weight of the letter's copy on the seat beside me. The road ahead looked thin as a string, but steady. For the first time since Tuesday, I believed there might still be room for a man to hold his ground without losing the people he loves. That night I barely slept. The clock on the nightstand glowed soft red numbers, each one louder than the last. I kept seeing Luke's face as I left the porch, torn between pride and the boy who once ran to me when thunder shook the windows. Before dawn, I gave up on sleep, dressed, and walked outside. Fog curled over the bay, smelling of salt and wet stone. I promised myself I would hold steady no matter what waited behind that door. By mid-morning I stood once more at the gate. Voices floated from inside, sharp and quick. I rang the bell. Megan opened the door halfway, blocking the hall with her body. She looked polished, as if company was expected. "Luke isn't home," she said. Her tone was smooth, but her eyes darted toward the living room. I stepped forward just enough for the screen to press against my coat. "Then I'll wait," I replied. I heard paper rustle, a low whisper. Then Megan's father appeared, holding a document. "We've drafted something for you to sign," he said, waving the paper slightly. "It clarifies that you allowed us to stay. For everyone's protection." He smiled. Too wide. Behind him, Megan's mother nodded, adding that it was just formality. "Hey," I asked to read it. The man hesitated but handed it over. The words were careful. A statement that I had lent the property to them indefinitely. That I relinquished occupancy until further notice. My signature would have turned the house from my anchor into a borrowed chair. I felt the tremor begin in my hands, then stop when I pressed my palm against the folder under my arm. "This isn't a formality," I said quietly. "It's a trap." Megan flushed, mumbling that I was misunderstanding. I turned to her. "I understand enough. If Luke asked me himself, we could talk. But I won't sign something written to erase me." Once, Luke came through the back door then, carrying groceries. He froze at the sight of us. "What's going on?" I held out the paper. "They wanted my signature," I told him. His face darkened as he skimmed the lines. "Dad." "I didn't," he started. But Megan's father interrupted, insisting it was only to keep things clear. Luke's jaw tightened. "Nobody signs anything," he said. "Not without a lawyer." Mastered knee. I placed the paper back on the table. "You have 6 days left," I reminded them. Calm, though my chest burned. "Use them to decide how you'll leave." Megan's mother scoffed. But Luke lifted a hand, silencing her. His voice was low when he asked them to give us a moment. They retreated, muttering. Luke leaned against the counter, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "I didn't know they were drafting that," he said. "I'm sorry." I studied him, the lines at the corners of his eyes that hadn't been there when Claire was alive. "You can still make this right," I told him. "Don't let their comfort cost you your father." "It is way." I gathered my folder and walked toward the door. Megan stepped aside, face tight with something between anger and unease. "You're making this harder than it has to be," she said. I stopped with my hand on the knob. "Life gets harder when people forget what's decent," I replied. Then left. Outside, the fog was lifting. Sunlight pushed through in pale bars, laying quiet gold across the roof. I paused at the lilac bush, brushed a finger over one leaf, and breathed until my ribs loosened. I had not raised my voice. I had not yielded. The house still knew my scent, even if others tried to write me out of it. I walked back to the truck. The paper they'd given me folded, but unsullied, in my coat pocket. Proof that dignity sometimes lives in silence. Morning came thin and pale. I took the folder and drove to Rivera and Ames before the bakery even opened its blinds. Ms. Rivera arrived with a paper cup and a wool coat, hair pinned tight against the wind. We went straight to the small conference room. She read my log, checked the letter copy, and nodded once. Then she drafted the petition with clean lines. No extra words. I signed where she tapped. She said she would file it at once and request an urgent hearing. Her voice was calm. Mine was smaller than I wanted, but steady. I walked down to the harbor while she filed. Boats thumped their ropes against the pier. A gull scolded the world from a lamppost. I sat on a bench and watched the tide creep over the dark rocks. My hands remembered Claire's hands, how she used to rub warmth into my knuckles when winter settled into the bones. I spoke to her without moving my lips. I told her I was trying to be the man she believed I was. I told her I was asking for help without throwing stones. Harris waved when I came back to the motel. He pressed a foam cup of coffee into my palm and told me to use the lobby if I wanted company. I thanked him and returned to my room. I set the folder on the desk and waited for the phone to do something other than be silent. It rang near noon. Ms. Rivera's voice came through brisk and gentle. The judge had read the file. The order was granted. 72 hours to vacate. A bailiff would serve it today or tomorrow. If there was no compliance, the court would set a time for enforcement. I did not cheer. I did not slump. I just let the words fill the room. Then I sat on the edge of the bed and put my face in my hands. Victory came on paper. Black ink on white. But my chest felt like a field after harvest. Cut down and bare. I thanked Ms. Rivera and asked her to send a copy. She said she already had. When the email chimed on Harris's old printer in the office, he brought me the printout with both hands, as if it might crack if he held it wrong. I walked to the church with the order folded in my pocket. The nave smelled like lemon oil and ash. Light slid across the floor in long, soft bars. I did not ask for more. I said thank you out loud. Once. And it sounded like a note from a low bell. Then I whispered Claire's name and told her the judge had given us a lamp for the path. I told her it hurt anyway. She would have understood that two things can be true at once. On my way back, I passed the square. A boy in a red coat fed crumbs to pigeons with fierce concentration. An old couple shuffled hand in hand toward the bakery door. The world was not different. I was different inside it. I sat for a minute and felt the order against my thigh. Warm from my body heat. I promised myself I would not let this paper turn me into a man who enjoys a win more than he grieves a loss. I called Luke. He answered on the second ring. My throat tightened when I heard his breath. I told him plainly that a court order had been signed. I told him a bailiff would come to serve it. I told him there were 72 hours to do right and to leave on their own feet. He said nothing for a long second. Then he asked if there was any other way. I said I had tried the other way. The phone line hummed. He said he was sorry. I said I wanted him to be careful with his words around his in-laws. He said he would try. It was not peace. It was a small place to stand. Back at the motel, I placed the order on the desk beside the letter from yesterday. 2 roads, invitation and boundary. I smoothed the edges with my fingertips. Then I opened the notebook and wrote a line so I would not forget it later. Justice should sound like a door opening, not like a window breaking. I underlined it once. Not because it was wise, but because I needed to see it twice. Afternoon rolled in with a gray sky. I walked to the bluff and watched the water darken. The wind pushed tears from my eyes, whether I wanted them or not. I let them come. I thought about the first night in this town. A very young man with a very cheap ring in his pocket, shaking as he asked Claire to marry him on this very bluff. She had said yes so fast that I laughed from relief. We walked home under a sky so clear we could see our breath rise and vanish like prayers. I carried that boy inside me even now. He stood beside me while an older man held a court order and tried not to break in two. The bailiff called near dusk. He said he would serve the order in the morning. His voice was flat, professional. I thanked him. After we hung up, I sat on the bed and laced my boots for no reason other than to do something with my hands. I counted to 10. I counted to 20. I pictured Luke carrying boxes without rage in his face. I pictured Megan looking down instead of staring me through. I pictured her parents closing the door softly. None of it felt likely. I believed anyway. Belief is a kind of work too. Night came early. I boiled water in the little kettle and poured it over a tea bag Harris had left by the cups. Steam rose slow. I held the mug between my palms until my fingers stopped stinging. Then I took the ring on its chain and laid it on the desk between the 2 papers. Claire's ring caught the thin light and made a small circle of brightness on the fake wood. I let that circle hold me. Before sleeping, I folded the scarf and put it with the order in the folder. I set the folder upright, like a book waiting to be opened in the morning. I lay back and stared at the ceiling stain until it turned into nothing. Sleep took me in jagged pieces and handed me back to the alarm while the sky was still dark. I dressed in silence and drove to Birch Lane. I parked at the curb as the first light drew a pale line above the pines. I did not step out yet. I sat with both hands on the wheel and told myself to keep my back straight and my heart soft. Claire's words were the only ones that could reach me through the noise. The order lay on the passenger seat. The badge would arrive with the sun. The next 3 days would decide whether we were still family or only people with the same last name. The knock came just after 9. A uniformed bailiff stood on the porch, hat in hand, a folded copy of the order against his chest. Luke opened the door behind him. Shoulders slumped. I stayed at the gate, letting them speak first. Megan hovered in the hallway, her parents peering from the kitchen with stiff faces, clutching mugs they didn't need. The bailiff's voice was level, careful, as he read the paper aloud. The words were plain. They had 72 hours to leave, and they were to hand me the keys once the house was clear. I walked up only when the officer finished. Luke signed the receipt, his pen scraping across the page. Megan's mother made a small noise of protest, but Luke shook his head. He didn't look at her. He looked at the floor, at the shoes he had outgrown long ago. I thanked the bailiff quietly and waited until his car disappeared down Birch Lane. Inside, the rooms were still full of their things, coats on hooks, grocery bags near the pantry, a line of shoes by the rug. I kept to the edges of the hallway while Luke told them to start packing. His voice trembled, but he didn't raise it. Megan carried boxes from the closet without a word. Her parents gathered cushions and porcelain knickknacks, wrapping them in paper that crinkled louder than it needed to. I stayed by the window, watching gulls wheel above the bay, trying not to measure each sound against Claire's laughter. Through the afternoon, I made myself useful. I carried cartons to the porch, stacked chairs by the door, tied string around bundles of linens. Not one argument rose between us, only the scrape of furniture, the shuffle of feet, the sigh of tape pulled from a roll. Luke paused once at the staircase, hand brushing the banister. He glanced at me, and in that glance was the boy who used to slide down that rail. Legs flailing, laughter spilling down the steps. I nodded, and he went back to work. By dusk, the last box stood near the threshold. Megan's father loaded it into the trunk of their car. Megan lingered in the living room, turning slowly, as if trying to memorize a place she'd never meant to call hers. She whispered something to Luke, kissed his cheek, and walked outside. Her parents followed, starting the engine but waiting until Luke finished. He stood alone by the door, keys dangling from his fingers. "I didn't think it would end like this," he said. His voice was hoarse, stripped of the certainty he wore all week. I stepped closer. "Neither did I," I told him. "But some walls hold more than plaster. They hold promises. We can't let them crack." He blinked hard, then placed the keys in my palm. Metal met skin, warm from his grip. We walked together to the driveway. Megan sat behind the wheel, eyes fixed forward. Luke touched my shoulder lightly, then climbed in beside her. The car rolled away, taillights bleeding red against the mist. I stayed until the sound faded. The street lay quiet, washed in the thin light of a street lamp. When I turned back, the house seemed to breathe. I crossed the porch slowly, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The air was cool and faintly sweet, like wood after rain. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it. For a long minute I let silence settle. Then I walked through each room, touching corners, straightening a frame, setting a chair back where it belonged. I swept the floor of stray crumbs, opened windows to let in night air, and wiped a streak from the kitchen counter with the sleeve of my coat. In the living room, I paused by the hearth. Claire's photograph rested on the mantel. Smiling through a summer long gone, I spoke to her softly. telling her the house was ours again, though the road back had cost more than I expected. I promised I'd keep it standing. For both of us. I picked up her scarf from the table, held it to my face, and breathed until my chest loosened. Outside, the bay lapped at the rocks, steady as breath. I turned off the porch light and locked the door. Tomorrow there would be scrubbing and mending, maybe a coat of paint for the railing. Tonight there was only the quiet weight of keys in my pocket, and the shape of home slowly finding its way back. I woke before dawn, not from habit but from the quiet that felt too large for one man. The house around me seemed to listen, waiting to learn if it still had a heartbeat. I dressed, brewed coffee in the old percolator, and stood by the window as a pale strip of light crept over the bay. For the first time in days, there was no echo of strangers' voices in the hall, only the slow tick of the clock above the stove and the sigh of the kettle cooling on the counter. By mid-morning, a knock came at the door. Luke stood there, hands buried in his jacket pockets, eyes rimmed red from a night without sleep. Behind him, the lilac bush leaned against the breeze. A quiet witness. He looked at me for a long breath before speaking. "Can I come in?" I nodded and stepped aside. We sat at the table. Claire used to polish with lemon oil. Luke ran his thumb along the wood grain, tracing it like a map. "I wanted to say I'm sorry," he began, voice low. "I let things get out of hand. I should never have asked you to leave. I thought I was helping everyone, but I was just avoiding a hard talk." His shoulders sagged as though the apology weighed more than the boxes he carried out yesterday. I poured him coffee, the way I used to on winter mornings before school. He took it, cradling the cup with both hands. "I didn't know what to do when Megan's parents lost their place," he said. I panicked, and then I defended my panic. He shook his head, a faint tremor in the gesture. "I let them treat you like a guest in your own home. That wasn't right." "Well," I listened, letting his words settle like dust after a storm. "We all stumble," I said finally. "What matters is what we do once we see where we fell." Luke's eyes lifted, searching mine for permission to believe there was still ground between us. "I want to make it right," he said. "If you'll let me." Had liver telf. We walked through the rooms together. Luke paused at the doorframe where his height mark stood, faded but unbroken. He touched the highest one and smiled faintly. "I remember this," he said. "You used to make me stand straighter so I'd get an honest measure." I smiled back. "You always tried to stretch anyway." He laughed softly, the sound thin but alive. We stepped onto the porch. The bay below glittered under noonlight, gulls tracing arcs above the water. Luke leaned against the railing, shoulders hunched. "Megan's shaken," he said. "Her parents, too. I think they're embarrassed. I don't know if they'll ever come back here. And maybe that's for the best. But I don't want this to sit like a stone between us." I put a hand on his arm. "Stones only stay if we leave them there," I said. He looked at me then, fully, as if seeing the man who had built this place with his hands and his heart. "Will you let me visit?" he asked quietly. "Maybe help fix the railing. I'd like to bring Sophie when she's free." The mention of my granddaughter's name opened something inside me. A space where warmth could return. "I'd like that," I said. Before leaving, Luke hesitated by the door. "Thanks for not yelling," he murmured. "You could have. And maybe you should have. But you didn't." I rested a palm against the frame, feeling the grain beneath my skin. "Your mother taught me that anger closes doors faster than it opens them," I told him. "I'd rather leave a door standing. In the busity, in the nest of mage." He nodded, stepped down the path, and turned back once to raise a tentative hand. I raised mine in answer. When his car disappeared beyond the bend, I stayed a while on the porch, the keys warm in my pocket, the air salted with spring. Inside, the house waited, patient and whole, ready to learn the new rhythm of voices that might fill it again. The following days passed with a gentleness I hadn't felt in months. Sunlight poured through clean panes, warming the floorboards where dust once gathered. I opened every window to let the sea air wander through, lifting the scent of old paper and lemon oil. Each breath of wind felt like a small permission to begin again. I started with the garden. The soil in the raised beds had grown hard under weeks of neglect. I fetched a spade from the shed, loosened the earth, and knelt among the rosemary and thyme Claire planted long ago. Shoots of new growth pressed up through brittle stems, stubborn against the chill. I clipped the dead ends, careful as a man touching memory. By noon my hands were stained with loam, the good ache of work humming in my shoulders. I set out marigold seeds in a neat row, the way Claire used to, humming a tune she loved. The song carried on the breeze like a quiet echo. Neighbors stopped by once they saw me out front. Mrs. Ellis brought a plate of blueberry muffins, still warm, and fussed over how thin I'd become. Harris from the motel drove by to return a pen I'd left behind. He stayed for coffee on the porch, telling stories about fishermen who swore the bay could read minds. Even Pastor Ray ambled over, leaning on his cane, and asked if I'd need help mending the fence before summer storms. Their kindness filled corners of the house that had been empty of voices. Inside, I worked room by room. I scrubbed the kitchen counters until the wood gleamed. I polished the old brass handles Claire once buffed with an old sock. I gathered the linens Megan's family had left behind and folded them into a box for donation. With each task, the house shed another layer of intrusion, revealing the quiet dignity we built here. In the evenings, I sat on the porch steps, watching the bay shift from silver to ink. Sometimes Luke would call to tell me about Sophie's school project or ask which paint to use on the railing. His voice carried less strain, more thought. We spoke about repairs, about memories, about nothing at all. There was still distance, but it no longer felt like a cliff, more like a river with a bridge half built. One morning I found an envelope wedged behind the door. Inside was a short note in Luke's handwriting. "Thanks for holding on. I'll try to be the son Mom would be proud of." Beneath it lay a photo of Claire holding baby Sophie in the backyard, both of them laughing into the sun. I stood there a long time, thumb brushing the paper, until tears blurred the edges. Work kept my grief from hardening. I sanded the porch railing until the grain ran smooth, then brushed on a coat of pale varnish. I tightened loose boards on the steps, steadying the place where Luke and Sophie might sit come summer. At dusk, I watered the marigold row, watching droplets catch the last light. The garden smelled of wet earth and rosemary, a blend sharp and sweet. As night settled, I lit the lamp on Claire's old writing desk. I placed her scarf across the back of the chair, smoothing its fringe. The house felt awake, no longer bruised by the voices that once crowded it. It carried a hush like pages waiting for a hand to turn them. I stood at the window, looking over Harlow Bay. Boats bobbed at anchor, their lights trembling on the water. Above them the moon climbed clear and calm. For the first time since Luke's words pushed me out, I felt not just safe but quietly hopeful. I whispered a thank you into the room, not only for the house returned, but for the chance to grow something tender out of what had splintered. Sunday came soft and clear. The bay lay flat as a well-swept floor. I baked cornbread in the old cast-iron pan because that is what Claire made when she wanted the house to smell like welcome. Butter melted into the crust and ran down the sides. I set the pan on a trivet and opened the front door. The lilac moved against the rail. The house breathed in and out. Before noon there was a knock. It was Luke and Sophie. She was taller than the last time I saw her, She wore a red sweater and a braid that swung when she hurried up the steps. She hugged me with both arms. No hesitation. Cheek pressed hard to my chest, the way small children do. I had to close my eyes for a second to keep from breaking. She asked if she could see the backyard. She asked if the birdhouse she painted at 8 was still there. I told her it was. Her smile landed in the middle of the room and stayed. We walked the yard together. The rosemary brushed our jeans. The birdhouse leaned a little, still the color of lemons. I told her we would straighten it with a new post. She said she wanted to help. Luke stood a few steps back, hands in pockets, eyes moving from fence to shed, counting the places that needed work. He said he could come by with sandpaper and paint next Saturday. I said Saturday was good. We shook on it like men who were learning each other again. Inside, we ate simple food at the kitchen table. Cornbread, sliced tomatoes with salt, cold milk in heavy glasses. I did not give a speech. I did not say the house had been bruised. I set out plates and forks the way Claire taught me, left to right, napkin folded once and set square. Halfway through the meal, Sophie looked at the doorframe and saw the pencil marks. She stood with her back to the wood. I measured her with my hand flat on top of her head. She laughed when she saw how close she was to the highest mark. She asked when I would add her line. I said today. After lunch, she drew, sitting at the table with her tongue between her teeth like a little copy of Claire. She sketched the lilac bush and a corner of the house. She wrote my name in the bottom right corner and added a heart, because she said the picture did not feel finished without one. I put the drawing on the refrigerator with the strong magnet shaped like a small blue fish. It looked like it had always been there. When they left, Luke walked back from the car alone and stood with me on the porch. He said Megan was staying with her parents for a while. He said they needed time. He said he would tell her that this house was not a place you move into like a hotel. He did not ask me to forgive everyone in a single day. He asked me to keep talking to him while he learned how to be a better man. I said I would. We shook hands, and then he pulled me into a hug that felt awkward at first. Then that evening I wrote a short note to Megan. I told her I hoped she would find a home that fit her parents well. I told her she could collect any dishes she had left. I told her I would keep a box at the entry table with her name on it. I did not add a paragraph about respect. I let the quiet of the note do that work. I put the envelope by the keys so I would remember to give it to Luke next time. Days settled into shape. I fixed the shed door. I oiled the hinges. I repaired the loose porch rail and laid a new board where the step had warped. Work put my hands where my heart could follow. Neighbors waved when they passed. Mr. Chen from the hardware store offered me a discount and then pretended to be offended when I tried to pay full price. Harris dropped off a sack of oranges and would not say why. He just said the house looked good from the road and that it made him happy to see a light in this window again. One afternoon I walked to the small cemetery on the hill. The grass was bright and a little wild. I carried a jar of marigolds from the yard. I cleaned the stone with water and a rag. I told Claire about Luke and Sophie. I told her I had kept my back straight and my heart soft, even when it would have felt good to let the first part do all the work. I set the jar on the ground and pressed my palm against her name. The stone was cool. It steadied me. I stood there until my breath matched the wind. I said her name once out loud to make the air honest. On my way home, I stopped at the bluff where we once watched winter storms and summer sunsets. The tide ran fast. Gulls slid on the air with their wings almost still. I sat on the old bench and wrote in my notebook. I wrote simple lines. A house remembers who treated it like a promise. A man can go to court without taking a knife to his family. You can be firm without being cruel. You can be kind without letting yourself be erased. I underlined the last line twice. I wanted it to live on the page the way it was starting to live in me. People ask for advice when they hear a story like this. Some ask for steps like the numbers on a recipe card. I do not have numbers. I have a handful of plain tools. If you are where I was, breathe. Do not answer the first insult. Sit down. Put your hands flat on the table. Speak less than you want to. Write down what happened in words a child could read. Find someone who knows the law and is not afraid of your sorrow. Choose paper over shouting. If you must knock, knock with your head high. If you must wait, do not let waiting turn you hard. Keep a small window open for the people you love. And close it only if they try to crawl through with a match. That night, Luke called from the store to ask what kind of varnish I used on the rail. He said Sophie wanted to help on Saturday. I told him where the brush was and how many coats to lay down. We talked about sanding with the grain. We talked about how many minutes to let it dry. We did not talk about Tuesday. We did not have to. Some days you build the bridge. Some days you simply do not kick it. Saturday came bright. They arrived with old clothes and a bag of sandwiches. We worked in easy quiet. Sophie brushed carefully, tongue out in concentration. Luke wiped a stray drip with a rag. He asked how much pressure to put on the paper when the grain turns. I showed him. His hand moved the way it did when he was small, careful and proud. We stopped at noon and ate on the steps. Sophie swung her legs and leaned against my shoulder. The rail shone in the light and looked new without pretending to be young. When they left, I stayed on the porch a while. The bay breathed. The house held still and solid. I thought of all the doors in this town and the lives behind them. I thought of the men and women who have been asked to leave places that held their names. I wanted to tell them they are not furniture. I wanted to tell them there is a way home that does not require breaking everything on the path. I cannot promise a judge will sign your paper. I cannot promise a son or a daughter will remember what you taught them at the first try. I can promise that keeping your back straight and your heart soft will not make you weaker. It will make it possible to live with yourself in the morning. The day folded into evening. I rinsed the brushes. I hung them by their handles to keep the bristles true. I closed the shed and checked the lock. I watered the marigolds in a gentle arc and let the ground drink. I wiped the kitchen table with lemon oil, the way Claire liked. Small circles. Patient hand. The wood drank the shine and gave it back. I set 2 cups next to the stove and boiled water. 1 cup for me. 1 cup for the woman I still talk to when the house is quiet. When the tea cooled, I carried my cup to the doorway and leaned against the frame. The pencil lines on the wood were soft in the lamplight. I took a pencil from the drawer, had Sophie stand straight when she returned, and drew her new height. I wrote her name next to it in neat letters. I went to the desk, opened my notebook, and added the date to the page where I keep the small bright things. Then I wrote a few words to whoever might one day read it out loud. If you are listening to this and you have been pushed to the edge of your own life, I am sitting with you in this kitchen. I am handing you a towel for your hands and a glass of water that is cold and clean. Rest here a moment. Decide who you want to be when you stand. Choose that man or that woman. Even if the ground shakes. Walk back to your house if you can. Build a new one if you must. Fix what is yours to fix. Let go of what is not. Do not hand your heart to anger for more than a minute. Do not hand your dignity to anyone at all. Night deepened over Harlow Bay. The porch light threw a soft circle on the steps. Somewhere, a bell buoy rang at a slow rhythm. I turned off the lamp, left the house in order, and went to bed. The mattress held me the way it always did. I lay there with my palm over the ring on its chain and felt the small, steady beat in my own chest. It sounded like a promise kept. I slept without dreams. When morning came, I woke to the smell of salt and coffee and wood warmed by light. I opened the front door and let the day come in. The house seemed to nod. I nodded back. We were still here. We were whole. And for the first time in a long time, I believed we would stay that way.